So we did just cover the thrusting swords, and today we are going to cover the heavy thrusting swords, which are basically the exact same thing, but just heavier. But in all seriousness, these are just more poking attack types weapons. These ones just are being a bit slower and is doing a bit more damage and more stance damage than the regular thrusting sword. They do pretty much get the exact same Ash of War options as well, but maybe a bit more for larger types of weapons too. And typically I do just prefer heavy thrusting swords more overall, because their two-handed movesets are not that much slower, but they just do a bunch more stance damage, which I value a lot. And those running heavy attacks are just incredible. They just cover so much distance really quickly. Now, in terms of the power stancing combos, I do not really like them that much either. If I did want to power stance poking attack types weapons, I would rather go with the great spears or regular spears, because those weapons hit simultaneously and just have much faster animations. But in terms of their two-handed moveset, I just think it's incredible. It's probably one of the best, if not the best two-handed moveset in the entire game. Now, starting off at the bottom, we have the QUEELIGN'S Greatsword. Now, this is not a bad heavy thrusting sword by any means, because it still gets decent damage. It actually has the most range out of all the heavy thrusting swords, and it does just get the regular heavy thrusting sword moveset. But I just consider it to be the least useful one, because it's only really good for one particular build, and that's with Faith infusions, because this weapon does have some split fire damage and come with a Faith scaling and can be infused. So going into a Flame Arts infusion just makes the most sense, because it's going to double down into that scaling, and you're going to get more damage than all of the other heavy thrusting swords with this Faith type of build. Now, unfortunately, this is just specific for the Flame Arts infusion, because with every other infusion, you're going to get more damage with all the other heavy thrusting swords that can be infused. They're not going to get as much range, but they're just obviously going to get more damage and also have better movesets too, because this one just gets the basic generic thrusting attack with its heavy. And honestly, even if I was going to go with a Faith build, I'd rather just go with one of the other options like the Great EPEE or the GODSKIN Stitcher, because they're actually going to get more damage in a sacred infusion. And sometimes when you fight enemies resist to fire damage, you want to be able to switch to a holy infusion instead. But this one does look really cool. Number 5, the Dragon King's CRAGBLADE, which is one of the weapons that has got unnecessarily nerfed when the DLC dropped with patch 1.12. This is a predominantly dexterity-based heavy thrusting sword with a very high dexterity requirement. Does get a bit of a strength scaling as well, so going into quality is still going to benefit, but unfortunately it doesn't get like a faith scaling, so it's not going to have any synergy with spells. Does this also get the regular heavy thrusting sword moveset with just the basic poking heavy attack, but the skill Thundercloud form is the best part about it, which for 28 FP, you turn into a cloud that can just move through the air, do a bunch of damage, stun lock enemies, and you come crashing to the ground to just do even more damage. Now, the total overall damage of the skill is pretty decent, but it's not that high, especially to how risky the skill actually can be, because obviously it is a very long animation, and you basically land right directly in front of the enemy, and you do have like a bit of a longer recovery animation too. So in most cases, you are going to be taking a lot of damage throughout. Now, you do also get infinite hype armor, so you're never going to get staggered out of it. But the thing is, this skill doesn't actually work with things like the multi-hit talisman or the Godfrey's icon if you have it fully charged. If it did work with these talismans, it would be doing a lot more damage. But the best thing about the skill used to be its stance damage, because it used to do 69 stance damage, which is some of the highest in the game out of all skills. But since patch 1.12, it now does 45 stance damage, which is a lot less, and for a long animation, it's not really that good. You could just do a charge attack plus a light attack, and it's going to do more stance damage than the entire skill combo. So the one thing that kind of made the skill a lot more worth it was its stance damage, and now that's no longer the case. Like, the weapon was not overpowered at all, so I don't really know why they changed it. If anything, it needed to get buffed to work with the multi-hit talismans and Godfrey's icon, but now it feels a lot more underwhelming to use. But it's not to say that it's bad at all, because this cloud animation does stagger those larger types of enemies like knights, omens, or even like millennia, and it can just make for a guaranteed stun lock. And upon crashing to the ground, it does send them flying too. But against these larger types of enemies that do not get staggered very easily, it's very inconsistent, because sometimes the skill can just overshoot its target, just straight up just whiff, or just not do enough damage. The weapon also does have the transitive properties of doing more damage to dragons, which there are a lot of dragons in the DLC as well. So it still is going to be a very useful weapon that is powerful throughout most of the game, but it's just way too inconsistent in my opinion for it to actually be an S tier option. Number 4, the GODSKIN Stitcher, which is an incredible weapon, and there's nothing that I can really say bad about it. It's a heavy thrusting sword that gets some of the most damage, and in fact, for certain types of infusions, it can actually be the highest damaging heavy thrusting sword. It also does get a unique heavy attack in this nice little double poke, which this double poke can just get amazing damage, proc status effects quickly, can help proc the multi-hit talismans, and you can just go into a build just spamming charged heavy attacks, and it can just be very viable. Now, the only reasons why it's not going to get higher is because 1, it just gets nothing but poking attacks. There's no real way to get horizontal swipes, which, as I always mention, I just like to have variety in my movesets. That's what I tend to value a lot, because there are plenty of circumstances to where I do wish where I have attacks that have wider hitboxes, because you can't really go wrong with better hit detection. But the main reason why it's not going to get that high is because the Sword Lance exists. Basically, all of the infusible heavy thrusting swords unfortunately have to compare to the Sword Lance, and it's probably just going to lack in every single area except for its running heavy attack. Like, if you did crutch on the running heavy attack of the heavy thrusting swords a lot, you could just go with this option. And obviously it is a lot earlier in the game as well, so it's not going to be useless. Number 3, the Great EPEE, which is another infusible heavy thrusting sword, and that is very comparable to the Godskin Stitcher. Gets very similar damage, range, weight, but there are going to be 2 different reasons why I prefer the Great EPEE over the Godskin Stitcher, and that's 1, it gets more damage with a strength build. With those heavy infusions at higher amounts of strength, it's just going to straight up outdamage the Godskin Stitcher. And as I mentioned, I think the heavy thrusting swords have some of the best two-handed movesets in the entire game, because a light attacks can be quick, and those running heavy attacks are just broken. And when you two-hand the weapon, it just gives you 50% more strength. So when going into a strength build, you're just going to get way more damage, assuming that you're not already at like 99 strength. Now, if you did actually want to go with some dexterity-based skills, things like Stormblade, Beast Roar, Lightning Ram, or Lightning Slash, they're going to pair better with the Godskin Stitcher, because that one scales better off dexterity. But as I mentioned with the Godskin Stitcher, I prefer the Great EPEE heavy attack because it's a nice horizontal swipe, good at hitting multiple enemies, or enemies like to move around a whole bunch. Any instance where you just feel like you just need to have some more coverage in your moveset outside of poking attacks because you want to have larger hitboxes, then the Great EPEE can just do that for you. It is basically just preference, hence them being both in the exact same tier. You can go either way and you're going to find plenty of success. And also to mention that the Great EPEE can be acquired right at the beginning of the game. It's literally right in Limgrave, sitting in a chest for you, and it can just carry from start to finish. But the main reason why they're not going to get any higher is because, once again, the Sword Lance exists, and that weapon just performs very similar, but just gets stupidly high amounts of damage. Number 2, the Bloody HELICE, one of the better arcane bleed types of weapons in the game. Does get you a very good arcane scaling, a decent dexterity scaling, and at these really high levels, it can just output really solid amounts of damage and proc bleed pretty quickly too. It does just get the average heavy thrusting sword moveset with just the basic poking heavy attack. Does actually get some of the most range in class, but the best part about the weapon is obviously going to be its skill, Dynast's Finesse, which this skill for 5 FP does give you an iframe dodge, and this iframe dodge basically has twice as many iframes as like a regular dodge roll. Now, it cannot be spammed as easily as a dodge roll, but it is going to be a lot easier to dodge certain attacks with this skill. But afterwards, you can actually do a follow-up lunging poking attack, and this poking attack lunges very far, obviously does piercing damage, staggers very well, and does 33 stance damage. Like, the fact that it can do 33 stance damage directly after a really good dodge in an instant is kind of just insane. And also, after this poking attack, you get an additional input that lets you do this double swiping attack, which the good thing about this swiping attack is that it's the only way to actually get a horizontal swipe with this weapon. But being that as a quick little double hit, it's gonna proc bleed pretty quickly. It also does an additional 22 stance damage, so this entire combo can just do 55 stance damage in only just a couple of seconds. And since the DLC, this skill actually does get boosted by the Arnsbark set. The entire set does just boost the damage by 14%. And there are some more additional types of bleed buffs that you can stack on top of this from the DLC or the base game, and it can just make for a very fun and broken playstyle. And at number 1, the Sword Lance, which is just broken. This thing gets more damage than things like Great Axes, and it's a heavy thrusting sword. Like, literally, if you just hit the two-handed soft cap at 54 strength, obviously having the weapon two-handed, it literally outdamages like some of the best strength type weapons in the game that are slower than this. Gets more damage than the Knight Rider's Glaive, Messmer's Soldier Spear, Rusted Anchor, Great Stars. It just outdamages all of those things, and it gets the speed of a heavy thrusting sword. Now, that's just going to be for its light attacks, because for its heavy attacks, it does actually get the Great Spear moveset, which is going to be a lot slower, and that also does extend to the running attack as well, which I don't really like as much, because the heavy thrusting sword running attack just covers so much distance. But the total overall damage is just undeniable. But the funny thing is about this heavy attack, between the heavy thrusting swords and the Great Spears, they get the exact same stance damage. So the existence of this weapon kind of just makes a lot of heavy thrusting swords and Great Spears just useless, because it's just going to outdamage all of them. And also, another benefit of having the Great Spear heavy attacks is that the guard counters are just better. Great Spear guard counters are just faster than heavy thrusting sword guard counters. So pairing this alongside a shield or the deflecting tier, it's going to be good at doing that as well. Now, the fact that this is a heavy thrusting sword, it means you actually get a lot of the poking attack types of weapon skills. So a lot of these different weapon skills, it's literally best paired alongside the Sword Lance. Using things like Piercing Fang or Impaling Thrust, you're just going to get the most amount of damage with the Sword Lance. The Sword Lance essentially becomes like the L2 stick for a lot of different types of skills. And also, another stupid part about the weapon, it somehow gets Colossal Sword types of status effect build up. For some reason, when you pair it alongside Bleed or Frost infusions, it just gets more status effect build up than all the other heavy thrusting swords by a considerable margin. So you can just go into a Bleed type of infusion, also retain an A scaling and strength, outdamage a lot of the other heavy thrusting swords, and just proc Bleed like a lot faster too. The only infusion I wouldn't pair it alongside with is with a Faith infusion. For whatever reason, it actually gets like the least amount of damage with a Faith infusion compared to all the other heavy thrusting swords, and I don't really know why. No other infusion is really like this. It's just for the faith-based infusions like Flame Art or Sacred. But yeah, this thing is just busted. Anyway, that is the video now done and complete. As for the next one, we're going to be covering the curved swords. There is like a whole bunch, like roughly 20 curved swords. So it might be a longer type of video, it might take a couple days to make. But if you are interested, please do like and subscribe. And also do follow me on Twitch as well, because I actually am going to start a Soulsborne marathon. Going to go through all the Soulsborne games, because it has been a little bit. Obviously with the DLC, we've been a little preoccupied. But it feels like it is a nice time to just go revisit them again. So definitely do check me out there. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.